Hello there, world history people. Let's learn all about World War II in Europe. Okay, so how did the war begin? Well, it was September 1st, 1939. Germany invaded Poland. In response, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and World War II is in full speed ahead. And Hitler didn't waste any time with how he started the war. He surprise attacked Poland, used all his brand new planes, all of his brand new tanks, and the Polish military was just kind of overwhelmed. Germany had this incredible weapon called the Stuka dive bomber. I've got a couple pictures of it right there. These things could drop really, really accurate bombs on targets. And the Luftwaffe is the name of the German Air Force. That's going to come up in at least one of the documents I present to you in class. So Germany's airplanes were just kicking butt. And Germany was definitely started off the war with a lot of wins. So let's click ahead. All right, there are those Stuka dive bombers dropping bombs. There they are flying all over Europe. And here's the Nazis marching into Poland. Hitler declares war. Oh no. The Luftwaffe doing the war. Okay, and what I think was Hitler's even bigger advantage were a lot of these German panzers. Panzer is the German word for tank. And throughout the entire war, Germany had the most impressive and biggest battle tanks out of any participant in World War II. The Polish didn't have anything that could go up against these things. And the Nazis will eventually in the war make these almost invincible tanks called the Tiger tank. And repeatedly in the war, these Tiger tanks would blow up like 10 of our tanks for every one of theirs we destroyed. So Germany's just got these super weapons, and they're pretty unstoppable. Okay, so here's some of those tanks rolling through. And here's these big, giant armored cannons. Okay. And Germany's going to use these fancy planes and fancy tanks to do a new tactic of warfare called Blitzkrieg. That's the German word for lightning war. And Germany's strategy of just kind of driving straight into the country, going straight to the capital city, finding the government, making them surrender before they have a chance to get organized, they're going to do this strategy over and over again. And Poland falls in 2 weeks, Denmark falls in 1 week, Norway falls in 2 weeks, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, that whole group in 2 weeks. So we're like less than 2 months into World War II, and the Nazis have already taken over like 6 countries. It's not looking good for the home team. Okay, and France, who's been a major world power for all of world history, France who held out for all of World War I, France didn't learn their lesson from World War I. They assumed that if there would be a World War II, it would just kind of be trench warfare all over again. And France had spent so much of the 1930s building this incredible defensive network right along the old trench lines in the German border called the Maginot Line. And the funny thing is the Maginot Line is still there today. The Germans knew it was a really good defensive fortress network, so the German High Command said, hey, why don't we just get all of our tanks and all of our planes, and we'll just blow a hole in this forest called the Ardennes Forest, and we'll sneak around the Maginot Line. And the French assumed that the forest was like so thick that tanks couldn't really get through it, that it was kind of a solid natural border. But the Germans just pushed right through that line really quick, and they totally avoided the French defenses. These German tanks then started driving all over the French countryside. Some of them get all the way to the Atlantic coast. Some get to the city of Paris. And the French government decides to just surrender the war and give up to the Nazis. So 5,000 tanks destroyed France. And yeah, the French and the British armies that were in the Maginot Line had to do a really fast retreat. And yep, France surrendered, but the British army did miraculously evacuate at a place called Dunkirk. There's a really good movie about that. But it's looking real bad, kids. The Nazis are on a major winning streak. Okay, moving on. So, Impenetrable Maginot Line, just go around it with your big old tanks. And here's the Maginot Line today. A lot of these guns were never fired. Nazis just totally ignored them. And this is a pretty interesting picture. I usually like to talk about this with the class. So this is a Pablo Picasso painting. He lived in Paris during the opening months of World War II. And I mean, I usually like to talk to students, what do you see? What emotion is in this painting? And a lot of kids talk about fear, sadness, pain, and, Pablo Picasso picked up on all this when he was living in Paris. And this painting was on display in a French art museum in Paris during World War II. And a Nazi officer in his full uniform and swastika on his arm and all that, he was there kind of admiring the painting. He looks over at Pablo Picasso and he asks him, he says, Pablo Picasso, did you paint this? And Pablo Picasso says, no, you did, to the German officer. So I think that's really telling of the kind of guy Pablo Picasso was. All right, and yep, Germany pushes through the Maginot Line. Okay, and so once France gives up, France actually gives half of their land, all of northern France, including Paris, to be fully commanded and organized by the German government. They allow for the southern half of France to become kind of a somewhat independent country called Vichy France, and Vichy France kind of allies with the Nazis and provides them with war materials and soldiers for the rest of the war. There is a group of French people led by a guy named Charles de Gaulle who decide to keep fighting the Nazis, and they kind of go into hiding and hide out in London and continue to fight the Nazis for the rest of the war. So in a way, the French people were kind of divided over should they accept the Nazis or should they resist them. The French colonies of Algeria and Madagascar, they decide to join up with the Vichy, effectively joining the Nazis. So now Hitler's got some parts of Africa on his side. If you remember, at the very end of World War I, the German military surrendered to the French military in this railway car. And at the end of World War I, the French people put that railway car in a museum and said, this is the exact spot where Germany surrendered in World War I. As soon as Hitler's army marches into Paris, and they know the French government is now asking to surrender, they say, hey, where was that railroad car? And they pull it out of the museum, and here's the picture. The Nazis force the French government to sit in the same seats that the German high command sat in, and here the Nazis are now the ones sort of accepting the surrender instead of the other way around. So, they got so salty about that in World War II. All right, and here's a bunch of Nazis marching through Paris. There's the Arc de Triomphe behind them. Here they are surrendering that railway car. Here's in Paris. It's not good, kids. Here's a French guy crying. And yep, France is totally occupied by the Nazis now. Okay, so now let's talk about Britain. All right, things were looking real bad. They started the war with a bunch of European countries as their allies, fighting just the Nazis. And within a couple months, everyone else had surrendered to the Nazis, and Britain was alone. Right around this time, Britain gets a new prime minister, a guy named Winston Churchill. And by all accounts, Winston Churchill was so instrumental in keeping the British fighting the Nazis throughout the war. A lot of other people would have quit, but Churchill will never quit. So high five to this guy, smoking cigars and drinking brandy all the time. He famously said, we will fight the Nazis on land, on the beaches, in the streets. We will never surrender. And he certainly doesn't. And he leads them all the way to victory. Here's some quotes by Winston Churchill. So you have enemies, good. That means you've stood up for something in your life. All right, that's nice. And I think this picture is also pretty funny. Scissors beats paper. It's true. It does beat him in the end. Okay, so the Nazis I'm sure they would have loved to just move their tanks right after Paris straight on to London, but the problem is Britain is an island, and the Nazis, they don't really have a lot of boats to bring their guys from France to England, so Hitler says, what if we just fight the British in the sky? The Nazis had a lot more planes than the British did, so they decided to just do this bombing campaign over all of the major cities of the United Kingdom. And so for a little more than a year, Nazi airplanes were just flying over all of the major cities, dropping bombs, trying to force the British people to give up and surrender. The British people, they had some planes of their own, so their planes would fly up into the sky and just every day over London, you'd see some incredible dogfights, and you hear air raid sirens going off. And this whole thing is called the Battle of Britain. It's also known as the Blitz. I've got some pretty great primary source documents you're going to read about this period. It's the only battle in the history of the world that's 100% in the air. No other battle applies to that statement. And Hitler really tried to destroy Britain's ability to make war and ability to fight back, but the British never quit. And eventually the Nazis kind of get frustrated and are like, okay, we'll just leave Britain alone. And a big thing that actually helped the British is they invented this new technology we still use today called radar. And radar is where these signals get sent from miles and miles away, and you can see if there's something either underwater or in the sky. Well, the water version is called sonar. So radar, you can see stuff's in the sky. So it's this early warning network and allowed the British to know when the Nazis were coming. So it's pretty great that they had that. All right, let's check it out. So here's some of those German planes dropping bombs. Here's the British fighting back, flying over the London Bridge. And actually, no, this isn't the London Bridge. This is the Tower Bridge. And here's some British kids crying because their house got blown up. And here's people looking at a bunch of destroyed buildings from German bombs. All right. And so Hitler, he realizes he can't beat the Germans in the air. So he's like, what if I just beat them on the sea? So he decides to put a whole lot of resources and effort into reviving the submarine campaign. I mean, it's the same strategy the Germans did in World War I, but Hitler gets a lot more submarines, and he has them just patrolling all over the coast along Britain, and anytime any ship comes close, his submarines just shoot a couple torpedoes at it and sink it to the bottom of the sea. His hope was to just starve out the British people and eventually make them quit the war, but Winston Churchill never quits. And these Nazi submarines would be a scary force all the way to the end of World War II. Definitely was really difficult to sail ships during this time because you never knew when a submarine might come and attack you. All right, so here's these German submarines sailing around. Here they are blowing up ships. Here's submarines on stamps, blowing up more ships right there. And then here's some British people. What do they get? They get a package of food from the USA because America cares. Good job. All right, and so Britain pushes their empire to the total brink. Okay, like Britain's calling up every single part of their empire, saying everybody's got to help. Okay, this is the greatest challenge we've had in 100 or more years. So many of Britain's colonies kind of remembered how they were treated in World War I, and a lot of them were skeptical about it. Okay, in fact, in India, this guy Mahatma Gandhi, he's going to be a major character later in history, he even starts sending letters to Hitler saying, hey Hitler, I don't want to help the British fight you. In fact, if you Nazis ever get to India, I'll open the doors for you. I just don't want Britain to be in charge anymore. So many parts of the British Empire were really stretched thin. And Winston Churchill promised a lot of these places, if you help us beat the Nazis, we'll give you independence when you're done. So maybe that convinced some people to help out, and the Australians start helping out, the Canadians start helping out, but it really was a huge challenge. And in fact, they decided to put every single young person into the war effort. They went 100% into total war. All young men had to join the military. Young women had to serve in factories or some other capacity. And here's a really interesting picture. This is Queen Elizabeth II. Even today in the year 2021, she is the current Queen of England. She's like 80 or 90 years old. But here she is when she was 17. She joined the army to fight the Nazis. They didn't put her as a frontline soldier. They put her as a truck mechanic. But even the princess is fighting the Nazis. That's pretty epic. So Britain's going 100% all in. All right, and here they are also rationing stuff. This is something I already talked to you about in World War I. So people can only buy certain amounts of specialty foods. There's the princess. Here's all the countries in the British Empire. So they're doing everything they can to help Britain fight the Nazis. Here's some artwork that the Nazis tried to spread around Asia, being like, why are you helping the British? They're not good for you. Gandhi and Hitler being friends. But here's so many of the British Empire fighting together. All right, Hitler had this one general who I think is a pretty noteworthy person in human history, a dude named Erwin Rommel. His nickname was the Desert Fox. And since his army is just kind of stuck in France and they've got nothing to do, he knows that the British have a lot of imperial possessions in Africa, so he sends Rommel and a bunch of his tanks to go fight the British in Africa. And, I mean, I could go off about Rommel for a long time. I've read a book about him. But he's really good at fighting. And in multiple times, Rommel had like 50 tanks and the British had 100 tanks. But Rommel just outplayed them and outmaneuvered them and always beat the British like every single time. So I don't know how specific I want to get with all this, but he just used so much cunning and deception to make the British lose battles they really should have won. All right, so there's Rommel right there. Here's a bunch of German tanks in Africa, and here they are fighting it out in the African deserts. Okay, so Hitler continues to use his army to blitzkrieg a couple more countries in Europe, takes over Yugoslavia, Macedonia, and Greece. Eventually, Hungary, Finland, and Bulgaria see the writing on the wall, and they're like, okay, the Nazis are kind of taking over, so we'll just join up with them. That way they don't have to fight us. So Hitler had more or less conquered all of continental Europe by this time. And Hitler's like, okay, I've got all these countries now providing me with military resources. I've got the biggest army in the world. What do I want to do? So he thinks back to his book, Mein Kampf. He's like, okay, I hate communism. I hate the Jewish people. I want more land for Germany in the East. And what answers all three of those questions? Well, it's attacking the Soviet Union. And if you remember, Hitler made an alliance with the Soviet Union. So what is he going to do? He's going to break that alliance and betray them and start the biggest conflict in the history of the world, the part of World War II where it's the Soviet Union versus the Nazis. All right. So here's a bunch of big old artillery cannons ready to fight. Here are the Nazis raising the flag in Athens. And here's a bunch of tanks getting ready for war. All right, here, I'm going to keep this going. So, on June 22nd, 1941, Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Hitler assembled this army of 4 million soldiers, and his goal would be to blitz the entire Soviet Union. And yeah, he betrays the Russians. The Russians thought they were his ally, but going to get proven way wrong. And the problem with using this blitz tactic, though, is so the whole point about blitz tactics is you drive your tanks, you fly your planes in really quick, and you secure all the major cities. But the issue is Paris is maybe 100 miles from the German border, so maybe you could, in perfect conditions, drive a 30-mile-an-hour tank there in like, I don't know, three days max. But the problem is Russia's major cities are really far into Russia. It's 3,000 miles from Moscow to the German border. So these quick blitz tactics aren't really going to work simply because Russia is so big. But Hitler's going to try to overcome that by just simply having a 4 million man army. Okay, so this is some of that German propaganda. The SS are fighting against the Soviet Union. Here's a bunch of Hitler's soldiers ready for war. Here he is looking at them before they go on their invasion. They're just going in all directions, taking over the Soviet Union. Here's a bunch of Nazis ready to fight. And then there's the Nazis there, but then these are all the other countries that they got to sort of commit resources to participate in this crazy big invasion. Okay, so yeah, and I've already just mentioned the Soviet Union is 3 times the size of all of Europe. And Stalin, once he actually hears that the Nazis have invaded and they're attacking his soldiers and taking over towns, Stalin refused to believe Hitler betrayed him. And actually, for 2 weeks, Stalin locked himself in his bedroom in Moscow and cried and did not effectively lead the Soviet Union. So for the first 2 weeks, there was no organization, and the Nazis had basically wiped out all of the defenses along Russia's border. So yep, there they are pushing in, and Nazis are taking command. Okay, and yeah, the Nazis push deep into Soviet territory. They destroy 5 Soviet armies, capture 2 million Russian soldiers, And by October of 1941, Russia only has 10,000 official soldiers remaining. This giant country was just getting slaughtered by Hitler's armies. By this time, Stalin's finally out of his bedroom, and he says, okay, what do we gotta do to beat the Nazis? Whatever we have to do, we're gonna do it. So the Soviet Union starts just giving guns to women and children, and they're just saying, everybody's gotta fight. We can't let the Nazis win. So, and I'm really glad he made that choice too. It could be living in a very different world otherwise. Okay, so here's a bunch of Nazis driving into the Soviet Union. Here's Soviet soldiers surrendering in the millions. Here's a Russian lady with a gun. And yep, all this land gets taken over by the Germans. They're now approaching the cities of Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad's down here. And here's one of these Soviet boys who's like 8 years old with a gun in his hand. Okay, and so as soon as the Nazis start invading the Soviet Union, Hitler decides that he wants to do the things he wrote about in his book. He wrote about annihilating the Jewish people of the world, and most Jewish people lived in the Soviet Union. He wrote about getting more land for the German people. He wanted the land of the Soviet Union. So Hitler actually orders his soldiers to slow down, and he starts having them spread out all over the countrysides of the Soviet Union, and he gives them the orders to just start exterminating people. And over the course of World War II, 1 out of 10 of all Russians would be killed by the Nazis. That's an incredible amount of murder. And something that I really have to emphasize to you kids in World War II is the Soviet Union and China were just these, the amount of massacres that occurred there by the Nazi army against Soviet Union and by the Japanese army against China is just almost unspeakable. And this is what makes World War II so unique. This was a war of extermination. The goal of these fascist governments was to wipe entire groups of people out. So I've got some pictures here of Nazis with guns aimed at people. Let's check them out. So yeah, if we look at who did most of the dying in World War II, more than 75% of the people who died were people who fought against fascism. And more than half of all deaths were Allied civilians. So hardly any German or Japanese civilians died in the war, which really says something. Yeah, and here's some massacres going on. Here they are shooting people. And man, this is just some really hardcore stuff that happened in the Soviet Union during this time period. Okay. Thankfully, though, as the Nazis were spreading out, doing these massacres, the weather started to dramatically change in Russia. This event known as Ratsbutissa, you probably remember Rasputin from the Russian Revolution unit. Well, Ratsbutissa is this changing weather where all the roads turn to mud. And Germany has all these really heavy, hardcore vehicles and these 2-ton tanks. Well, they're just going to sink right into the mud. And German soldiers are going to just almost be consumed by the land of Russia itself. So this really slowed down the Nazi advance and gave the Soviet Union time to put up a proper defense. So here's Nazi guys trying to dig out a truck from the mud. Here's a tank that they just left behind because it got stuck. Here's some guys stuck in the mud, stuck in the mud. And here's a modern Russian tank that is very much stuck in the mud. Oh, goodness. Okay, so, and also a really lucky thing is winter came early for Russia in the year of 1941. It started snowing, I think, in like the first week or so of November, and it would become the coldest and fiercest winter in Russia's history. The Russian people are way more acclimated to cold weather, the Germans not so much. A lot of those Nazis, they never even had winter weather uniforms. They kind of marched in to the Soviet Union in June and they were like wearing shorts. It's not going to help you. And the snow began to fall just as the German soldiers could see the city of Moscow, so it came right at the perfect time, and German soldiers were quickly starting to freeze. So now the weather of the Soviet Union is doing more damage to the Nazis than even the Soviet soldiers are. All right, moving on. So, as soon as the snow clears, Hitler decides to reposition his armies, and he says, okay, the Soviet Union has now built this really good defense in Moscow, this really good defense in Leningrad, but in the southern part of the Soviet Union, that's where they have most of their factories, that's where they have most of their oil, and the Nazis were starting to run out of oil. So Hitler sort of moves the majority of his military aggressive force, and he says, we're going to push deep into the southern Soviet Union. And the big city in the southern Soviet Union is the city of Stalingrad. And Hitler kind of recognized, if I take over this city, I will control the major river in the southern Soviet Union. I'll be able to funnel a bunch of oil back to Germany, and we'll probably win the war. So Stalin knew that as well. Stalin's going to send every guy he has to defend the city of Stalingrad, and it will turn into the biggest single battle in the history of the world. Let's check it out. So here's some Nazi guys fighting in the city of Stalingrad. Here they are battling it out in Stalingrad. Oh my goodness. Okay, and in the Battle of Stalingrad, 3 million Russians and 1 million Germans will die. It is a crazy, crazy battle. It's like man versus man kind of tactics. And the Soviet Union still didn't have their military fully ready to fight this war, or fight this battle especially. So what they did was something called human wave tactics. They sent in these soldiers without weapons, okay? They just said, hey, you're some Russian guys. We need you to go to Stalingrad. We need you to fight the Germans. They're like, okay, you're going to give us like a gun or a knife or a sword or something? And they're like, no. You're going to run at the Germans, and you're going to make the Germans waste bullets. And once the Germans run out of bullets, then we're going to send in the real soldiers to kind of finish them off. And so, yeah, millions of Russian men died in that event. And this battle was just like the Nazis had destroyed the city of Stalingrad so much, they actually couldn't drive their tanks through the city. So it had to turn into a whole bunch of like soldier versus soldier direct fighting. The Nazis called it Rattenkrieg, or the Rat War. Eventually the Soviet Union will make the Germans run out of military equipment, and the military, or the German army in Stalingrad, will surrender. And once they surrender, the Germans never win another major battle again for the rest of World War II. So this is a huge turning point battle, and the Soviet Union remembers this really well. Today, in the city of Stalingrad, there's this giant 80-story tall statue called the Motherland Calls. And I'll zoom in on it real quick. The Motherland Calls. So yeah, look, that's a person, and this is the statue. This lady has her sword pointed towards Germany and her hand pointed toward the people of Russia and says, "Follow me, let's get victory." Here's those human wave tactics. And this is Poltov. By all accounts, he is the greatest hero of the Soviet Union. He was this guy who lived in Stalingrad and just refused to let the Nazis take over his house. Here's a picture of his house. He put up a defense there for something like 3 months. He brought a bunch of his friends over, and the Nazis attacked him every day. And every day he pushed them back. So thank you for not letting the Nazis win, Poltov. You're a good dude. All right, and then here's there's a lot of movies about Stalingrad, and it's definitely the big turning point in World War II. And now here's the Soviet Union stabbing the swastika snake. They're gonna push out and win the war. Okay, so all of those Nazis that surrendered in Stalingrad, it's kind of an interesting story what happened to them. So 300,000 Nazis gave up to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union knew all of the evil and terrible things that the Nazis did to the people of Russia. So the Soviet Union took these 300,000 Nazis, sent them into this valley close by to Stalingrad, and there they were all killed. But why do I bring this up? Well, it's because those dead Nazi soldiers, their bodies weren't buried. They were just left there in that field. And that's why still to this day, they call it the Peschanka Bone Fields. And still in the year 2021, you could travel to Russia. I don't really recommend it, but you could go to nearby the city of Stalingrad. Today they call it Volgograd. And you will find this valley nearby where there's just tons of human bones, and a lot of them are still wearing their Nazi outfits. So to all those people who, think like the Nazis did something good in World War II, this is where you can find 3,000 Nazi people to see what their fate was. All right, so here's the end of the Nazis outside Stalingrad. Here's some of those bodies. Here's the bone fields. Here's Peszczanka today. They're digging up human remains. And all of these were once Nazis who invaded the Soviet Union. They're all dead. All right, that's it for me. See you in the next one.